Part 1. Introduction. Before we begin, please like and subscribe for more resourceful information on different neurodivergent topics. It means the world to us and helps more families find the support they need. There is a question that sits at the heart of millions of lives. A question asked in school corridors, in GP waiting rooms, across kitchen tables at the end of exhausting days. The question is simple, but the answer is anything but. Why is it so hard to just focus? For centuries, that question was met with the wrong answers. Laziness, defiance, poor parenting, a lack of willpower. Children were punished for symptoms they couldn't control. Adults were written off as unreliable, chaotic, difficult. The world looked at people with ADHD and saw a problem to be fixed, when in reality, it was looking at a brain wired differently, trying to survive in a world not built for it. ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, is now one of the most researched neurodevelopmental conditions in the world. It affects an estimated 5 to 7% of children and around 2 to 5% of adults globally, though many researchers believe those figures are a significant undercount, particularly when it comes to women, girls, and people from marginalized communities who have historically been overlooked by diagnostic systems. But ADHD is not a modern invention. It is not a product of screens, sugar, or lazy parenting. The patterns we now associate with ADHD, the impulsivity, the inattention, the emotional intensity, the restless energy, have been observed, documented, and debated for centuries. What has changed is not the condition. What has changed is our understanding of it. In this documentary, we are going to take you on a journey. We will travel back through history, through the earliest recorded observations of what we now call ADHD, through the moments of discovery and misdiagnosis, through the controversies and the breakthroughs. We will look at what science now tells us about the ADHD brain. We will explore how diagnosis works, why it so often fails certain groups, and what it means to receive a diagnosis at any age. We will look at the full range of support available today, from medication to therapy, from educational adjustments to lifestyle approaches, and we will ask what the future might hold. This is not a story about disorder. This is a story about difference, about the long, complicated, often painful, and ultimately hopeful journey toward understanding one of the most fascinating neurological profiles that exists in the human population. Let us begin. Part 2. The earliest observations. ADHD through history. Long before there was a name, there were descriptions. The earliest written account that many historians associate with ADHD-like behavior comes from ancient Greece. Hippocrates, writing around 400 BC, described patients who had what he called quickened responses to sensory experience, poor attention, and a tendency toward passionate reactions. He believed it was caused by an overbalance of fire over water in the body, and he recommended a diet of fish, water, and physical activity, an approach that, perhaps surprisingly, has echoes in some modern lifestyle recommendations. For the next 1,000 years or so, such descriptions remained scattered across medical texts, but without any systematic framework. The traits we associate with ADHD were often framed through moral or spiritual lenses. Inattention was sloth. Impulsivity was sin. Children who could not sit still in church or at their lessons were not seen as neurologically different. They were seen as willfully disobedient, and they were treated accordingly. The early modern period began to shift this, slowly. In 1798, the Scottish physician Sir Alexander Crichton published a medical text entitled An Inquiry into the Nature and Origin of Mental Derangement. In it, he described a mental restlessness present from birth that made sustained attention almost impossible. and he noted that people with this quality found any fixed object of attention to be insupportably tedious. This is widely recognized as one of the earliest clinical descriptions of what we now call the inattentive presentation of ADHD. Then, in 1845, a German physician named Heinrich Hoffmann, writing not a medical paper but a children's book, created a character who would become unexpectedly significant in the history of ADHD. Fidgety Philip, from the book Der Struwwelpeter, is a boy unable to sit still at dinner, rocking his chair, pulling the tablecloth, causing chaos. The story was written as a cautionary tale, but it was also a remarkably accurate behavioral portrait of hyperactive ADHD that a practicing physician had observed in his own patients. In 1902, the condition received its first major clinical framing. The British paediatrician Sir George Still delivered a series of lectures to the Royal College of Physicians in London, in which he described 20 cases of children with what he called an abnormal defect of moral control. These children were described as impulsive, inattentive, and unable to sustain focus, but Still was careful to note that they were not unintelligent and that their behavior did not appear to be the result of poor upbringing. He was proposing, for perhaps the first time in mainstream medicine, that this was a neurological difference rather than a moral failure. George Still is often referred to as the father of ADHD research, and while the language he used is not one we would use today, his core instinct, that these children had a brain difference deserving of medical understanding rather than moral judgment, pointed in the right direction. Part 3. The 20th Century. Naming the condition. The 20th century was a period of enormous scientific progress and, at the same time, enormous confusion when it came to what we now call ADHD. The condition was real and increasingly visible to clinicians, but what to call it, how to frame it, and who it applied to shifted dramatically across the decades. The first major turning point came not from a laboratory, but from a public health crisis. In 1920, in the aftermath of an epidemic of encephalitis lethargica, a form of brain inflammation that swept through populations following the First World War, physicians began observing that many survivors, particularly children, displayed significant changes in behavior. They became impulsive, hyperactive, distractible, and emotionally dysregulated. Because the cause was neurological damage, it forced clinicians to consider that similar presentations in children without a history of illness might also have a neurological origin. This led to the coining of the term minimal brain damage in the 1930s and 40s, later revised to minimal brain dysfunction, when it became clear that most affected children showed no detectable physical damage. The term was clumsy and stigmatizing, but it represented an important conceptual shift, from a moral model to a medical one. In 1937, a psychiatrist named Charles Bradley made one of the most significant accidental discoveries in the history of ADHD treatment. Searching for a way to treat headaches in children following spinal taps, he administered benzodrine, an amphetamine stimulant, and was astonished to find that many children showed dramatic improvements in behavior and school performance. He published his findings, but the medical establishment was largely unreceptive. The idea that a stimulant could calm a hyperactive child seemed counterintuitive, and the research was largely ignored for nearly 2 decades. The 1950s brought the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, published by the American Psychiatric Association. The condition didn't yet have its own category. It would take another decade for that to change. In 1960, the American psychiatrist Stella Chess introduced the concept of hyperactive child syndrome, emphasizing hyperactivity as the core feature. This was incorporated into the second edition of the DSM in 1968, under the name Hyperkinetic Reaction of Childhood. The framing was narrow. It focused almost entirely on physical hyperactivity, applied almost exclusively to boys, and was understood as something children simply grew out of. This assumption, that ADHD was a childhood condition that resolved with age, would take decades to dismantle, and the damage it did in the meantime was significant. An entire generation of girls were missed. An entire generation of adults were left without support, told their struggles were personal failings rather than a continuing neurological difference. The 1980 revision of the DSM, known as DSM-3, was a turning point. For the first time, inattention was recognized as a central feature of the condition, not just hyperactivity. The name changed to Attention Deficit Disorder, or ADD, with two subtypes, with and without hyperactivity. The age of recognition was broadening, but it was still far from complete. Part 4. The DSM Journey and the Evolution of Diagnosis. If you want to understand how our relationship with ADHD has changed over time, one of the best places to look is the history of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The DSM is the primary reference tool used by clinicians in the United States and widely across the world to classify and diagnose mental health and neurodevelopmental conditions. And its evolving treatment of ADHD is a story within a story. One of scientific progress, social influence, and the slow recognition of who gets left behind. We left the story in 1980, with the introduction of ADD as a formal diagnosis with inattention at its center. But in 1987, the DSM-3 revision collapsed the two subtypes back into a single diagnosis, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, and removed the inattentive without hyperactivity category entirely. This was a step backward for many, particularly for girls and women, whose ADHD often presents primarily as inattention, without the visible physical hyperactivity that historically attracted clinical attention. It was not until 1994 and the publication of DSM-4 that the three presentations we recognize today were formally codified: predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive impulsive, and combined presentation. This was a major step forward. It acknowledged that ADHD looked different in different people, and that the restless, disruptive boy in the classroom was not the only valid picture of the condition. The most recent edition, DSM-5, published in 2013 and updated in 2022, made further significant changes. The age at which symptoms must first appear was raised from 7 to 12 years old, a change that helped capture people whose ADHD was less obvious in early childhood. The requirement that symptoms cause impairment in multiple settings was refined to a requirement that they simply be present in multiple settings, acknowledging that impairment can be masked or compensated for. And for the first time, a diagnosis of ADHD was made possible even in the presence of autism spectrum disorder, reversing a previous rule that had excluded many autistic people from receiving an ADHD diagnosis. The UK uses a slightly different framework. The ICD, or International Classification of Diseases, published by the World Health Organization. For many years, the ICD used much stricter criteria than the DSM, requiring symptoms to be present across all settings and at a severity that led many clinicians to underdiagnose. The most recent edition, ICD-11, has brought the two frameworks much closer together, adopting a more dimensional view of ADHD that aligns more closely with modern neuroscientific understanding. But diagnosis remains deeply unequal. Study after study has shown that girls are diagnosed later than boys, often not until adolescence or adulthood, by which point many have accumulated years of anxiety, self-blame, and strategies designed to hide their difficulties. Black children in the United States are significantly less likely to receive an ADHD diagnosis than white children displaying identical symptoms. Adults, particularly those diagnosed late in life, often face clinicians who are unfamiliar with the adult presentation of the condition. And in many countries, long waiting lists mean that formal diagnosis remains inaccessible to many who need it. The diagnosis is not the destination, but for many people, it is the beginning of finally being seen. Part 5. The ADHD Brain, What Science Tells Us. For much of the 20th century, ADHD was described, debated, and treated without a clear understanding of what was actually happening inside the brain. That began to change in the 1990s, as neuroimaging technology advanced sufficiently to allow researchers to compare the brains of people with and without ADHD in real time. What they found transformed our understanding of the condition and fundamentally challenged the idea that ADHD is simply a behavioral problem. At the center of the story is the prefrontal cortex. This region of the brain, located just behind the forehead, is responsible for executive functions, the set of cognitive processes that allow us to plan, organize, regulate impulses, shift attention, manage time, and regulate our emotions. In people with ADHD, research consistently shows differences in the development and functioning of this region. Studies led by neuroscientist Philip Shaw and his colleagues at the National Institutes of Health found that the cortical maturation of children with ADHD lagged behind their neurotypical peers by an average of 3 years. The brain was not absent these functions, it was developing them on a different timeline. The neurotransmitter systems of the ADHD brain are also different. Dopamine and norepinephrine, the chemical messengers responsible for signaling reward, motivation, and attention, function differently in people with ADHD. The brain's reward pathways are less sensitive to low-level stimulation, which helps explain many of the features of ADHD that can seem puzzling from the outside. The tendency to hyperfocus intensely on activities that are novel, urgent, or deeply interesting. The difficulty sustaining effort on tasks that feel repetitive or low reward. The constant search for stimulation. These are not character flaws. They are the predictable outputs of a brain with a different dopamine profile. The role of the cerebellum, once thought to be involved only in motor coordination, has also emerged as significant in ADHD research. Differences in cerebellar volume and connectivity have been linked to the timing difficulties, motor restlessness, and difficulties with emotional regulation that many people with ADHD experience. Crucially, research has confirmed that ADHD is highly heritable. Twin studies consistently show heritability rates of around 70 to 80%, making it one of the most heritable of all neurodevelopmental conditions. If a parent has ADHD, there is a significantly elevated chance that their child will too. This has important implications for how families understand themselves and for the growing number of adults who receive their first diagnosis only after their child is assessed. It is also worth being clear about what the neuroscience does not tell us. It does not tell us that ADHD is a simple deficit, or that the ADHD brain is inferior. Many of the features associated with ADHD, high creativity, intense passion, the ability to hyperfocus, pattern recognition, risk tolerance, divergent thinking, are associated with the same neurological profile. The ADHD brain is not broken. It is tuned differently. And in the right environment, with the right support, it is capable of extraordinary things. Part 6. ADHD in childhood. Recognition, school, and early support. For many families, the journey with ADHD begins in childhood, often in the classroom. It is in the structured, sit still, listen carefully environment of a school that the ADHD brain most visibly struggles. And it is often a teacher, rather than a parent or doctor, who first raises a concern. But the picture of ADHD in childhood is more varied than popular culture suggests. The disruptive, hyperactive boy bouncing off the walls is one presentation. But there is also the quiet girl sitting at the back of the class, staring out of the window, who completes half her work and forgets the rest. There is the child who melts down every afternoon when they get home, having spent the entire school day holding themselves together through sheer force of effort. There is the child described as bright but underachieving, or as having potential they just don't apply, when in reality their brain is working twice as hard as anyone realizes just to keep up. Research into what is sometimes called the home-school presentation discrepancy is particularly important here. Many children with ADHD appear to manage adequately in one setting while falling apart in another. This is not inconsistency or manipulation. It is the result of masking, the enormous cognitive and emotional effort of suppressing ADHD traits in high-demand environments, followed by the inevitable crash when the mask comes off. Early identification matters enormously. Children who receive appropriate support early, whether through diagnosis, educational adjustments, or therapeutic intervention, have significantly better long-term outcomes across academic achievement, self-esteem, and mental health. Yet in the UK, average waiting times for a paediatric ADHD assessment on the NHS currently run to several years in many areas. Many families find themselves paying privately or navigating a system not designed to help them. In schools, the support framework matters. In England, the SEND system, Special Educational Needs and Disabilities, provides a legal structure through which children with ADHD can access adjustments and additional support. This may include extra time in exams, movement breaks, a reduced distraction environment, chunked instructions, and in more significant cases, an Education, Health and Care Plan, or EHCP, which legally mandates a specific package of support. But the quality of that support varies enormously between schools, and the process of obtaining an EHCP is frequently described by families as exhausting and adversarial. Too many children spend years without the support they need, accumulating not just academic gaps, but damage to their sense of self. The message they receive, implicitly or explicitly, is that they are failing, when in truth, the system is failing them. What children with ADHD need above all else is to be understood, to have adults around them who know that their difficulty is real, that their effort is genuine, and that their brain, in the right conditions, is capable of remarkable things. Part 7. ADHD in adults. Late diagnosis and lived experience. For a long time, ADHD was considered a condition of childhood, something you had as a boy, maybe grew out of as a teenager, and certainly left behind by adulthood. We now know this to be wrong. Longitudinal research tracking children with ADHD into adulthood shows that the majority continue to experience significant symptoms across their lifetime. The hyperactivity may become more internalized, manifesting as restlessness, racing thoughts, or an inability to relax rather than physical fidgeting. But the inattention, the impulsivity, and the emotional intensity typically remain. The number of adults receiving ADHD diagnoses for the first time has risen sharply over the past decade. This is driven partly by better clinical awareness, partly by the removal of the childhood onset requirement from diagnostic criteria, and partly by a wave of public conversation, particularly on social media, in which adults have been sharing their experiences of recognizing themselves in descriptions of ADHD for the first time. Late diagnosis is a complex experience. Many people describe it as a profound relief, a moment of suddenly understanding decades of their own life. The jobs lost, the relationships strained, the projects abandoned halfway through, the chronic lateness, the missed deadlines, the emotional volatility, the crushing sense of not living up to their own potential, despite trying harder than anyone around them knew. For many, a diagnosis reframes their entire autobiography. They were not lazy. They were not failing. Their brain was wired differently, and nobody told them. But late diagnosis also brings grief. Grief for the years spent struggling without support. Grief for the version of themselves they might have been if they had known sooner. And sometimes, grief that gives way to anger. At a system that missed them, dismissed them, or actively pathologized them without ever looking for the right explanation. Women and girls are disproportionately represented among late diagnosed adults. Research consistently shows that the female presentation of ADHD, often more internalized, more heavily masked, more weighted toward inattention and emotional dysregulation than overt hyperactivity, is less likely to be recognized in childhood. Girls are socialized to compensate, to people-please, to sit quietly even when their mind is in chaos. They develop coping strategies that disguise their difficulties, sometimes so effectively that even their closest relationships are unaware of the effort required. By the time many women are diagnosed, they are also managing co-occurring conditions, anxiety, depression, and eating disorders being particularly common, that have developed in the years of unrecognized struggle. Treating those conditions without addressing the underlying ADHD often provides only partial relief. A late ADHD diagnosis does not close every door. For many adults, it opens them. Part 8. Medication. History, evidence, and controversy. No aspect of ADHD has generated more debate, in clinical settings, in parenting groups, in the media, and around family dinner tables, than medication. And that debate, while sometimes overwrought, reflects genuine and important questions about how we treat one of the most common neurodevelopmental conditions on the planet. The story of ADHD medication begins, as we touched on earlier, with Charles Bradley's accidental discovery in 1937 that benzodrine improved behavior and focus in children. His findings were largely ignored at the time. It was not until the 1950s that another stimulant, methylphenidate, developed by Ciba Pharmaceuticals and marketed under the name Ritalin, entered clinical use. By the 1960s and 70s, it had become the dominant pharmacological treatment for hyperactive children in the United States, and it remains, in various formulations, one of the most prescribed medications in the world today. In the UK, the two primary classes of ADHD medication are stimulants, including methylphenidate, sold as Ritalin, Concerta, and Equisim, among others, and amphetamine-based medications, primarily lisdexamfetamine, sold as Vyvanse or Elvanse. A non-stimulant option, atomoxetine, is also available, as are some other medications prescribed less frequently. The choice of medication, dose, and formulation is highly individual. What works well for one person may not work at all for another, and finding the right fit often requires a period of trial and adjustment under medical supervision. The evidence base for stimulant medication in ADHD is substantial. A landmark 2018 study published in The Lancet, which reviewed data from over 133 randomized controlled trials and more than 10,000 children, found that methylphenidate and amphetamines were significantly more effective than placebo in reducing ADHD symptoms in children. For adults, a similar body of evidence supports the use of stimulant medication as an effective first-line treatment. NICE guidelines in England and Wales recommend medication as part of a comprehensive treatment approach for school-age children, adolescents, and adults where symptoms cause significant impairment. But medication is not without its complexities. Side effects can include reduced appetite, sleep difficulties, raised heart rate and blood pressure, and in some cases, emotional blunting. These effects are dose-dependent and often manageable, but they require careful monitoring. There are also populations for whom stimulant medication is contraindicated, or requires particular caution, including people with certain cardiovascular conditions, a personal or family history of psychosis, or some co-occurring conditions. The controversy around ADHD medication is not purely clinical. It is also social and philosophical. Critics argue that stimulant medication is overprescribed, that children are being medicated for behaviors that fall within the range of normal variation, or that should be addressed through environmental and educational change rather than pharmacology. Proponents argue that withholding effective medication from those who need it is itself a form of harm, that no other medical condition would be met with the same level of resistance to treatment. The most balanced view is probably this: medication is a powerful tool. It is not the right tool for everyone, and it works best as part of a wider package of support, not as a substitute for it. Part 9. Beyond medication. Therapy, strategies, and support. Medication, where it is appropriate and effective, can change lives. But it is not the whole story of ADHD support. And for many people, whether by choice, by medical circumstance, or while waiting for a formal diagnosis, the question of what else can help is one of the most practically important they will face. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, adapted specifically for ADHD, has a strong evidence base. Traditional CBT focuses on identifying and changing unhelpful thought patterns. ADHD-adapted CBT goes further. It addresses the executive function deficits that underlie many of the practical difficulties people with ADHD face: disorganization, procrastination, time blindness, and the emotional volatility that so often accompanies them. Studies by researchers including Stephen Safran at Harvard Medical School have shown that ADHD-adapted CBT produces significant improvements in organization, time management, and emotional regulation, particularly in adults. ADHD coaching is a distinct and growing field. Unlike therapy, which often focuses on psychological processes, ADHD coaching focuses on practical strategies and accountability. A coach works with a client to set goals, break tasks into manageable steps, build systems that work with the ADHD brain rather than against it, and maintain momentum. For many people, particularly adults, coaching provides a level of practical, personalized support that other forms of intervention do not. Parenting programs designed specifically for families of children with ADHD are also well supported by evidence. Approaches such as the New Forest Parenting Program in the UK and the work of Russell Barkley on parent training have consistently shown improvements not only in children's behaviour, but in parental stress and family functioning. Understanding that a child's behaviour is neurologically driven, rather than willful, changes everything about how a parent responds to it. And co-regulation, the process by which a calm, regulated adult helps a dysregulated child return to a settled state, is one of the most powerful tools a parent of a child with ADHD can develop. In schools, reasonable adjustments are not just helpful. They are, in many countries, a legal requirement. Movement breaks, fidget tools, flexible seating, chunked instructions, visual schedules, reduced homework loads, and extended time on assessments are among the adjustments that can make an enormous difference to a child with ADHD. Not by making things easier in an unfair sense, but by leveling a playing field that is currently tilted sharply against them. Lifestyle factors also play a meaningful role. Exercise is one of the most well-supported non-pharmacological interventions for ADHD, with research showing that aerobic exercise increases dopamine and norepinephrine availability, producing effects on attention and executive function that can be comparable, in some studies, to low doses of stimulant medication. Sleep hygiene matters enormously. Sleep difficulties are extremely common in ADHD, and chronic sleep deprivation significantly worsens every dimension of the condition. Diet, while not a cure, is worth attending to. The evidence for omega-3 supplementation in ADHD is moderate but consistent, and avoiding blood sugar spikes through regular, balanced eating can help stabilize attention and mood. And perhaps most importantly, community. Finding others who understand your experience. The rise of ADHD communities online, in parent groups, in social media spaces, has provided something that no clinical intervention fully can: the experience of being known, understood, and not alone. Part 10. Conclusion. Different wiring, different strengths. We have travelled a long way in this documentary, from the descriptions of Hippocrates in ancient Greece to the accidental discovery of stimulant medication in 1937, to the neuroimaging studies of the 1990s that showed us for the first time what was happening inside the ADHD brain. From the misdiagnosed and the overlooked, the girls told they were daydreamers, the adults told they were lazy, the children told they just needed to try harder, to the growing movement of people who are claiming their diagnosis not as a label of deficit, but as an explanation and as a beginning. ADHD is not a modern invention. It is not the result of bad parenting, too much screen time, or too much sugar. It is a genuine, heritable, neurobiologically grounded difference in the way the brain develops and functions, one that has existed in human populations throughout recorded history, and one that, in the right conditions, is associated with some of the most extraordinary qualities any human brain can possess. The challenges are real. The ADHD brain, in a world designed for neurotypical processing, faces genuine daily difficulties. Executive dysfunction is not an excuse. It is a barrier. Time blindness is not laziness. It is a neurological experience. Emotional dysregulation is not immaturity. It is the output of an amygdala with a hair trigger and a prefrontal cortex that takes longer to apply the brakes. These things deserve to be taken seriously, supported properly, and understood compassionately. But the strengths are also real. The creativity, the hyper-focus that can solve problems in hours that might take others days, the pattern recognition, the empathy, the tenacity of someone who has spent a lifetime finding ways to navigate a world not designed for them and has kept going anyway. The history of ADHD is, in many ways, a history of the world slowly learning to see a group of people it had been looking at and misreading for centuries. We are not at the end of that story. Waiting lists are too long. Diagnosis is still too unequal. Support in schools is still too inconsistent. Adults are still being missed. Stigma is still very much present. But we are further along than we were, and the direction of travel is clear. The goal is not to turn an ADHD brain into a neurotypical one. The goal is to give every person with ADHD the understanding, the tools, and the environment they need to live fully as themselves. Different wiring, different strengths. Thank you for watching.